911, what's your emergency?
The whale! Oh God, the whale's got her! It's dragging her under!
Stay calm, sir. Where are you?
Pacific Marine Park. She's not coming up. She's fighting, but it's not letting go.
In the dim blue waters of a marine park, a trainer's bond with a killer whale turned into a nightmare. What began as a routine show descended into terror, leaving a young woman fighting for her life in front of a horrified audience. This is Melissa Carter's final story. From the time Melissa Carter was a child, the sea held her in a quiet spell. Growing up in a small coastal town, her earliest memories were of tide pools, seashells, and long afternoons watching the waves roll in with a rhythm that seemed eternal. Like so many children drawn to the mystery of the ocean, Melissa filled her room with books on whales, dolphins, and the deep unknown, where other kids might have dreamed of becoming astronauts or movie stars. She dreamed of swimming alongside the giants of the sea. By the time she reached her teenage years, that fascination had sharpened into purpose. She volunteered at local aquariums, shadowed trainers during demonstrations, and absorbed every detail about marine mammal care. She wasn't just captivated by the grace of dolphins or the intelligence of killer whales. She was determined to be part of their world. In her journals, she wrote of a future where she would dedicate her life to marine life education, performing shows that inspired others to respect and love these animals the way she did. Her opportunity came in the early 1980s, a period when marine parks were at their peak of popularity in North America. For millions of families, these facilities represented both entertainment and wonder, a chance to see majestic animals up close, to marvel at their power and intelligence. But behind the applause and the carefully choreographed performances, these parks also reflected a broader cultural belief that the ocean's most powerful predators could be tamed, trained, and displayed for human amusement. Pacific Marine Park, located on the rugged coastline of Washington state, was one such place. Smaller than the global giants like SeaWorld, it nonetheless stood as a local landmark, a seaside facility that promised excitement, family memories, and a brush with nature's most awe-inspiring creatures. The centerpiece of its attraction was its Orca program. Killer whales, or orcas, had become the icons of marine entertainment. To the public, they were thrilling and charismatic, performing leaps and spins with trainers balanced gracefully on their backs. To the industry, they were a symbol of man's ability to bring the ocean's apex predators under control. For Melissa, being hired as an orca trainer at Pacific Marine Park was nothing short of a dream fulfilled. At just 24 years old, she found herself in a world she had long imagined: wetsuits, whistles, fish buckets, and the breathtaking closeness of working daily with killer whales. To her, this wasn't merely a job. It was the culmination of years of devotion, study, and a belief that she could build a bridge between humans and the creatures she admired most. Each day began before the crowds arrived. Melissa would walk the damp concrete corridors, her footsteps echoing against the tanks that held the park's greatest stars. Trainers like her fed, cleaned, and rehearsed routines with animals that weighed several tons. She learned their quirks, their body language, the subtle signals that revealed mood and intent. To her, these were not simply animals in captivity. They were companions, partners in a delicate and dazzling performance that united biology with showmanship. The shows themselves were spectacles of controlled chaos, carefully choreographed but electrifying in their execution. Trainers dove into the water, launched into the air on the backs of whales, and executed rehearsed gestures that drew gasps from the crowd. Every performance ended with applause, laughter, and the awe of children pointing toward the pool. For the audience, it was pure magic. For Melissa, it was a calling, a chance to share the love she had carried since childhood with every person in the stands. But beneath the beauty of those moments lingered a quiet tension, one not often visible to the public. The orcas, magnificent and intelligent, were also unpredictable. They had been taken from the wild, separated from families, confined to tanks far smaller than the oceans they once roamed. While trainers and staff formed bonds with them, they also knew, in the back of their minds, that these were powerful predators, capable of sudden and deadly force. Melissa, like many trainers of her era, balanced that knowledge with optimism. She believed in the mission, the connection, and the dream. To her, the risks were worth it. She had made it. The little girl who once knelt at tide pools now stood on the back of an orca, arms outstretched as thousands cheered. Yet, as with so many dreams, the line between wonder and danger was thinner than it appeared. And for Melissa Carter, the ocean she had built her life upon was about to reveal a much darker truth. The story of captive killer whales begins not with entertainment, but with fear. For centuries, orcas were seen as dangerous predators, even earning the name killer whale from sailors who watched them hunt seals and whales in coordinated packs. That perception shifted dramatically in 1964, when the Vancouver Aquarium in Canada captured a male orca later named Moby Doll. What began as an attempt to kill the animal for a museum display turned into a scientific and public revelation. For the first time, people saw an orca up close, intelligent, trainable, and far from the mindless killer it had been portrayed to be. This moment sparked a global industry. Marine parks recognized the commercial potential. Families would pay to witness these ocean giants leap from the water, perform tricks, and seemingly connect with human trainers. By the late 1960s and 70s, the capture of wild orcas had become common. Pods in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Puget Sound and off the coast of British Columbia, were torn apart by speedboats, nets, and explosives used to corral entire families into shallow bays. Calves were taken. Adults were sometimes killed to conceal the scale of the captures. Between 1962 and 1977, at least 50 orcas were removed from Washington state waters alone. Pacific Marine Park in Seattle was one of the many facilities that capitalized on this new fascination. Smaller than SeaWorld, it nonetheless played a significant role in popularizing orca performances along the West Coast. The park purchased young whales from these brutal roundups, housing them in tanks only a fraction of the size of their natural habitat. For the public, the sight of a trainer diving alongside a black and white giant was breathtaking. For the whales, the reality was confinement, deprivation, and isolation. Orcas in the wild are highly social animals. They live in pods that span generations, with complex communication systems and tightly bonded family structures. In captivity, this social fabric was shattered. Whales from different pods with different dialects and social behaviors were forced together. Tanks provided no escape from conflict, no distance from aggression, and no space for natural behaviors. Some individuals developed visible signs of psychological stress, swimming in repetitive circles, chewing on concrete walls until their teeth broke, floating motionless for hours at a time. Aggression, too, became more pronounced. In the wild, there is no recorded instance of an orca killing a human. In captivity, however, incidents began to surface. Trainers were bitten, pulled underwater, and in some cases nearly drowned. One of the earliest tragedies occurred in 1971 at Marineland in Buenos Aires, where a trainer named Hugo Espinoza was fatally crushed during a show. In 1987, another trainer, Kelty Byrne, drowned after being dragged by 3 orcas at Sealand of the Pacific in British Columbia. These events were often dismissed as accidents or blamed on trainer error, rather than acknowledged as signs of the deep stress and unpredictability caused by captivity. Pacific Marine Park itself was not immune to these tensions. Though it never achieved the international scale of SeaWorld, the park housed orcas in similarly restrictive conditions. Trainers like Melissa Carter worked in close contact with animals that were, in truth, never fully under control. Audiences saw synchronized leaps and playful splashes. What they did not see were the subtle displays of agitation, the head slaps, the sudden refusals to perform, the long periods of listlessness. These were signals of distress, warnings that the stage beneath the applause was a fragile and dangerous one. As the 1980s unfolded, the sheen of glamour around captive orca shows began to thin. Incidents of aggression were harder to ignore. Lawsuits and protests started to question the ethics of keeping apex predators in concrete tanks. Still, the shows continued, the tragedies downplayed, the risks absorbed into the cost of doing business. For Melissa Carter, Pacific Marine Park was the dream she had always longed for. But for the orcas, it was a life far removed from the freedom of the open sea, a life defined by confinement, stress, and a mounting tension that would one day erupt into catastrophe. For Melissa Carter, every morning began with the same ritual. Before the gates opened, before the laughter of children echoed through the stands, she walked the narrow walkways that wound around Pacific Marine Park's tanks. In her hands, she carried buckets of thawed herring and smelt, the currency of trust in a world where human and predator met eye to eye. Her bond was with a young orca, an animal whose power was undeniable even in stillness. Weighing several tons, capable of moving with explosive force, the whale was both a partner and a looming reminder of the stakes. To Melissa, that bond felt personal. She believed she knew the whale's moods, its moments of playfulness, even its stubbornness. When it nudged her gently with its rostrum or allowed her to balance on its back during rehearsals, it was easy to see cooperation as trust and trust as safety. Daily routines were precise, structured down to gestures and whistles. Trainers rewarded compliance with fish and tactile reinforcement, rubbing the whale's skin in spots it seemed to enjoy. Melissa's commands were delivered with practiced signals, a raised hand, a blown whistle, the toss of a fish. In return, the whale performed spins, breaches, and synchronized movements that thrilled audiences. Behind the spectacle was a system of conditioning. Every behavior, no matter how dramatic, was broken into smaller steps, taught over weeks or months. When Melissa dove into the pool, when she climbed onto the whale's back, the illusion was of perfect harmony, a young woman and an apex predator united in trust. But the truth was far more fragile. Control relied on compliance, and compliance was never guaranteed. To the audience, none of this was visible. Families filled the bleachers, their faces lit with excitement as music swelled through loudspeakers. They saw Melissa leap fearlessly into the water, surfaced with the orca beside her and soar into the air on its massive body. They saw carefully choreographed moments, smiles, splashes, and the seeming joy of a predator performing for human applause. What they did not see were the subtle refusals, the instances where the whale ignored a signal, delayed a trick, or turned its massive head in a way that revealed tension. For the park, these moments were smoothed over, hidden beneath the glamour of the show. The public narrative was one of connection and mastery, of humans forming bonds so strong that danger had been tamed. Melissa herself believed in that story. Like so many trainers of her generation, she held on to the idea that her devotion, patience, and care created a bridge between species, but beneath the surface, the truth simmered. Orcas in captivity lived in an environment stripped of choice and space. Deprived of the open sea, they often exhibited unpredictable behaviors. Trainers knew the risks, though they rarely spoke of them outside of professional circles. Even minor incidents in nip during feeding, a trainer dragged briefly underwater, were often dismissed, written off as misunderstandings rather than warnings. Melissa was not naive to this reality. She had studied the reports, seen the moments when whales displayed aggression toward their handlers, yet she chose to believe that her bond was different. She believed that the whales she worked with trusted her, that the countless hours of training, the shared routines, had created something unshakable. The audiences believed it too. When they clapped and cheered, they were not witnessing a struggle between instinct and conditioning. They were watching the illusion of control. They saw a dream. The ocean's fiercest hunter transformed into a willing partner, tamed by human skill and affection. What lingered beneath that dream, however, was the unspoken truth. No matter the years of training, no matter the bond, a predator remains a predator. Trust could only extend as far as the limits of instinct would allow, and on the stage of Pacific Marine Park, those limits would one day be tested in the most devastating way possible. It was a summer afternoon in 1987 at Pacific Marine Park. The skies above Seattle were clear, the air warm, and the ocean breeze carried with it the sound of seagulls circling overhead. Families lined the boardwalks, children clutching popcorn and souvenirs as they filed into the stands of the Orca Arena. The pool shimmered in the sunlight, a perfect stage for the park's biggest attraction. Melissa Carter was already in position backstage. At 24, she had settled into the rhythms of her role. The wetsuit, the whistles strung around her neck, the ritual of sorting fish into buckets for awards. To the crowd, she would appear fearless, the embodiment of confidence and harmony with the animal she had dedicated her life to. Behind the scenes, it was simply routine. Another performance in a long string of shows she had done dozens of times before. That afternoon, the arena was packed. Every seat was filled, the atmosphere alive with expectation. For many in the audience, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. To see a killer whale, the ocean's apex predator, leaping effortlessly into the air just a few yards away. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Cameras clicked into position, and the hum of anticipation swelled into cheers as the announcer's voice boomed across the loudspeakers. Melissa entered the stage to applause. She carried herself with practiced ease, smiling as she waved to the crowd. The orca surfaced beside her, its slick black dorsal fin cutting the water like a blade. It responded to her signals with precision, rising in a dramatic hop, then crashing back into the pool in a splash that drenched the first rows of the audience. Laughter and shrieks filled the air. To the crowd, it was pure magic. But beneath the spectacle, subtle signs were already surfacing. Trainers often spoke quietly of moments when the whales resisted commands or hesitated before performing. To the untrained eye, it looked like personality, a playful pause, a stubborn streak. But to those who knew the animals, such moments could signal irritation, frustration, or fatigue. That day, the whale Melissa worked with seemed restless. Its tail slapped the water with a force that echoed against the arena walls, a display that could be interpreted as excitement or agitation. When Melissa signaled for a routine breach, the whale delayed, circling the pool instead. The crowd laughed, assuming it was part of the act, never realizing that deviation was the first hint of danger. Melissa pressed forward, masking the tension with a professional smile. The show moved into its centerpiece, the waterwork routine. This was the moment when trainers entered the pool, blurring the line between human and predator. It was the act that thrilled audiences most, but it was also the one that carried the greatest risk. Melissa dove into the water with the orca, surfacing moments later as it propelled her high into the air. The crowd roared. Cameras flashed. From the stands, it looked like perfect trust. A young woman carried skyward on the strength of an ocean giant. When she landed back into the pool, the choreography continued. Spins, dives, synchronized movements between trainer and whale. But those watching closely might have noticed the growing unease. The whale's movements were sharper, less fluid, its responses delayed. At one point, it broke away from Melissa, submerging longer than expected before resurfacing on the opposite side of the pool. The audience clapped at the dramatic pause, unaware that Melissa's whistle had gone unanswered. Backstage staff exchanged nervous glances. Trainers knew that unpredictability was always a possibility, especially with orcas kept in captivity for years. But in front of a crowd of hundreds, the show had to go on. The illusion of control was everything. Melissa, focused and composed, gave the signal for the finale, a spectacular sequence designed to end the performance on a high note. The orca was meant to lift her from the water once more, carrying her across the pool in a breathtaking display of power and precision. The audience leaned forward, cameras ready, children gripping the railings in excitement. The stage was set. The crowd expected awe. Melissa believed she was moments away from completing another flawless routine. But beneath the surface of the pool, in the silence where whistles and signals meant little, instinct was stirring. The illusion of harmony between human and predator was about to fracture, and what followed would silence the applause forever. The finale was meant to be the show's most breathtaking moment. Melissa Carter, smiling under the bright summer sun, gave the familiar signal as the orca circled below. The crowd leaned forward, cameras raised, anticipation heavy in the air. It was the act that always brought the house down. Trainer and whale rising together. The illusion of trust between predator and human sealed in applause. But in a fraction of a second, the illusion shattered. Instead of lifting Melissa gracefully toward the surface, the orca lunged with a violent burst of power. Its jaws clamped around her leg, dragging her beneath the water with a force that stunned even the most seasoned staff watching from the sidelines. One moment, the crowd was cheering. The next, there was silence, the kind of silence that comes when hundreds of people cannot process what they are seeing. Melissa's body disappeared in a trail of bubbles as the whale thrashed beneath the surface. The audience gasped, then screamed, the realization spreading through the stands like a wave. Parents shielded children's eyes. Some clutched the railings, unable to look away. What had moments earlier been a spectacle of harmony had transformed into a scene of horror. From the pool deck, co-workers rushed to act. Trainers shouted commands, blowing whistles in sharp succession. The signals drilled into the whale for years of conditioning. Fish were thrown into the water in desperate attempts at distraction. But the orca ignored them all. What had been predictable responses in countless rehearsals were suddenly meaningless against the surge of instinct. Melissa reappeared for a moment, her body breaking the surface as the orca surged upward. She gasped for air, arms flailing, her training instincts taking over, reaching for the signals, trying to stay composed, fighting for control in the chaos. But there was no control left. The whale's massive body arched, dragging her under once more with terrifying speed. The crowd erupted in panic. Some screamed Melissa's name, others shouted in disbelief. Children cried as parents pulled them from the front rows. The stadium that had been filled with cheers only moments earlier now rang with chaos, confusion, and fear. Underwater, Melissa's world was darkness and force. Years of training had taught her that the key to survival was calm, resisting the urge to thrash, using conditioning cues to redirect the whale's behavior. But the rules she had learned did not apply here. Every instinct to survive collided with the grim reality that she was in the grip of an apex predator weighing several tons. Her attempts at control were no more than whispers against the roar of raw power. Trainers on the deck continued their frantic efforts. Poles were lowered into the water to distract or push the whale away. Buckets of fish were hurled in every direction. But the orca seemed locked onto Melissa, treating her not as a partner, but as prey, or perhaps as an object of rage built from years of captivity. Minutes stretched like hours. Each time Melissa surfaced, she struggled for breath, only to be dragged under again. Some in the crowd sobbed openly. Others turned away, unwilling to witness what was unfolding. Park staff moved to evacuate sections of the stands, while emergency teams were summoned. Though even they knew the grim truth, nothing could match the sheer dominance of the animal in that pool. At one point, Melissa managed to cling to the whale's dorsal fin, hauled momentarily toward the surface. It looked, for a fleeting instant, like she might regain some measure of control. But, with a violent twist, the orca flung her aside, her body striking the water with a sickening impact before being pulled under yet again. The brutality of the motion erased any last illusion that this was an accident. Those closest to the scene described the sound of the whistles echoing endlessly, a desperate chorus that seemed more futile with each passing second. Trainers shouted Melissa's name, begged the whale to respond to commands it had obeyed countless times before. But the water boiled with violence, the dark fin slicing the surface as if to remind everyone present that this was its domain, not theirs. The audience, frozen in collective shock, bore witness to the unthinkable. The celebrated bond between human and orca reduced to carnage before their eyes. Some would later say they could still hear the screams, still see Melissa's arms reaching out of the water in her final struggle. Others described the eerie silence that followed each submersion, the dreadful anticipation of whether she would resurface again. By the time rescue teams reached the poolside with nets and stretchers, it was too late. The orca released Melissa only after the struggle had already claimed her life. Her body floated to the surface, limp and unresponsive, as the water stilled around her. The stands were eerily quiet now, emptied of the laughter that had filled them only half an hour earlier. Parents carried sobbing children away, some too shocked to speak, others whispering in disbelief at what they had seen. For the trainers and staff, grief collided with horror, and with the unbearable weight of understanding, this was the risk they had always known but never fully acknowledged. In that moment, the fantasy of human mastery over nature collapsed in full view of the world. What began as a celebration of trust had ended in chaos, terror, and the irreversible loss of a young woman who had built her life around a dream. The day that should have been another routine show at Pacific Marine Park became instead a chilling reminder. Beneath the applause and the carefully crafted illusion, a predator had always remained a predator. The water was still when it was finally over. What had moments earlier been a stage 4 spectacle now carried only the weight of tragedy. Melissa's body floated lifeless at the surface, her wetsuit torn, her arms motionless against the shimmering pool. The Orca circled slowly nearby, its massive fin slicing through the water in eerie calm, as though the violence of the last minutes had never occurred. For a brief moment, the stadium was frozen in stunned silence. Hundreds of spectators sat in shock, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The sound of sobbing children broke the quiet, followed by hurried footsteps as parents gathered belongings and pulled their families from the stands. The laughter and applause that had filled the arena only half an hour earlier had been replaced with panic, grief, and disbelief. Trainers rushed to Melissa, dragging her body toward the pool's edge. Medical staff leapt into action, performing chest compressions on the deck in desperate attempts to revive her. Whistles still sounded intermittently, a futile effort to keep the orca at bay, though the animal appeared strangely subdued. Its earlier thrashing had given way to silence, its head occasionally breaking the surface, watching the chaos it had created. Every attempt to save Melissa was in vain. The prolonged struggle underwater had taken away any chance of survival. The reality became undeniable as the minutes stretched on. Emergency crews covered her with a sheet. For her colleagues, men and women who had trained alongside her, who had shared in the dream of bridging the gap between human and orca, the grief was immediate and crushing. They had lost not just a co-worker, but a friend, and they had lost her in the most horrifying way imaginable. The audience, too, carried scars. For many, the sight of a young woman being dragged beneath the water again and again would never leave their minds. Some parents would later speak of their children waking in the night, screaming, replaying the images of Melissa's final struggle. What had been marketed as family entertainment had turned, without warning, into a collective trauma. The park moved swiftly to usher spectators out, announcing that the show was over, that an incident had occurred. But there was no way to contain what hundreds had just seen with their own eyes. The silence that followed them out of the stadium was heavier than any announcement could explain. Families shuffled away in shock, conversations hushed, many too shaken to even speak. Inside the pool, the orca resumed its slow, deliberate movements, circling as if nothing had happened. Trainers who had once celebrated its intelligence and playfulness now looked upon it with dread. This was no longer a performing partner. It was a reminder of the unpredictable force that captivity could never fully contain. For the first responders, the sight was surreal. The stadium was nearly empty now, but the echoes of panic still hung in the air. The bleachers, damp from the splashes of the performance, bore silent witness to the tragedy. The smell of salt water mixed with the metallic temps of blood. The stage that once symbolized joy had transformed into a crime scene of nature's raw and unforgiving power. In the days that followed, reporters would search for words, officials would issue statements, and investigations would begin. But in that moment, in the silence after the storm, all that remained was the weight of loss, the haunting image of a dream turned nightmare, and the quiet circling of an orca in a pool too small for its wildness. In the days after the attack, Pacific Marine Park became the center of a storm it could not contain. Local authorities opened an investigation, seeking answers to the questions that hung heavy in the air. How could a performance designed for entertainment end in such violence? Was Melissa Carter's death the result of negligence, or was it simply the inevitable reality of working with a predator confined to a tank? Witnesses were interviewed, from trainers who had worked alongside Melissa to families who had sat in the stands that afternoon. The accounts were harrowing. Descriptions of her body dragged beneath the surface, of frantic whistles and desperate attempts to intervene, of a crowd left traumatized by the spectacle of her final moments. Each testimony underscored the same truth. The incident had unfolded in full view of hundreds, and no amount of spin could erase what they had seen. The park's official response was measured and cautious. The spokespersons expressed condolences to Melissa's family, praising her dedication and love for the animals, but behind the words was an effort to frame the tragedy as an unpredictable accident, a reminder, they said, of the risks inherent in working with powerful creatures. To critics, it was a familiar refrain, a way of deflecting responsibility and avoiding the deeper, more uncomfortable questions. Melissa's family grieved privately, but their loss reverberated publicly. She had been young, devoted, and full of conviction. To many, her death symbolized not just personal tragedy but the hidden dangers of an industry built on the illusion of control. As investigators combed through training logs and safety protocols, patterns began to emerge. This was not the first time an orca had shown aggression toward a trainer. Records from marine parks around the world revealed a long history of incidents, bites, near drownings, moments of violent unpredictability. Yet most of these cases had been minimized, buried in reports that never reached the public. Each time the industry's narrative remained the same. These were accidents, not warnings, but experts in marine biology and animal behavior saw something different. They pointed to the psychological toll of captivity, the stress, the isolation, the lack of natural social structures. Orcas in the wild travel up to 100 miles a day, hunting in coordinated pods and engaging in complex social behaviors. In captivity, they circled tanks, barely large enough to stretch their bodies. Their aggression, these experts argued, was not random. It was the product of confinement, frustration, and the collapse of instincts that could not be contained within concrete walls. The debate reached beyond the specifics of Melissa's death. Were marine parks, by holding orcas captive for entertainment, creating ticking time bombs? Every show, every performance, was built on the assumption that conditioning and training could override millions of years of instinct. But the attack made clear that this assumption was fatally flawed. For the public, the tragedy sparked unease. Families who had once cheered from the stands began to question what they had witnessed. What had been sold as wonder now seemed dangerous, even exploitative. And for the industry, Melissa's death was more than a tragedy. It was a crack in the carefully maintained facade, a reminder that the cost of captivity was not measured only in the suffering of the whales, but in the lives of the humans who stood beside them. The investigation closed with no charges filed. Officially, it was labeled a tragic accident, but for those who had seen the truth firsthand, the conclusion felt hollow. Melissa Carter had lost her life, her family had lost their daughter, and the orca remained circling in its tank, unchanged, unpunished, and still on display. The cost of captivity could no longer be denied. The only question left was how long society would continue to accept it. In the weeks that followed, Melissa Carter's name appeared in headlines across the country. News outlets replayed grainy clips of her performances, her smile, her confidence, her grace alongside a predator that most people would never encounter outside of the ocean. To her colleagues, she was more than a trainer. She was a friend, a mentor, and a believer in the bond between humans and animals. To her family, she was a daughter whose passion had become her undoing. Tributes poured in from fellow trainers, many of whom had long wrestled with the risks of their profession. They described her as fearless, dedicated, and deeply connected to the whales she worked with. Memorials were held both privately and within the park, where flowers and letters filled the gates. For many who had witnessed the tragedy firsthand, the images of that day were impossible to erase. Yet, in remembering Melissa, they spoke less of her final moments, and more of the life she lived, one marked by devotion, discipline, and an unshakable belief in her calling. But even as her memory was honored, the park itself faced pressure it had never known before. The incident ignited debate not only about safety protocols, but about the ethics of orca captivity itself. In the immediate aftermath, some changes were quietly made. Trainers were barred from entering the water during performances, a precaution that stripped shows of their most dramatic moments, but was deemed necessary to protect lives. Behind the scenes, emergency procedures were reviewed. Safety barriers were reinforced, and the risks of direct interaction were reassessed. Yet these measures did little to silence a growing public unease. For decades, marine parks had cultivated an image of harmony, trainers working hand in hand with apex predators, dazzling audiences with displays of control and cooperation. Melissa's death shattered that illusion. The orca's power had not been subdued. It had simply been restrained until the moment it wasn't. The tragedy added fuel to a broader cultural shift already underway. Animal rights groups amplified their campaigns, pointing to Melissa's death as proof that the practice was not just cruel to whales but dangerous to humans. Documentaries and public protests increasingly challenged the narrative of marine parks as places of education and wonder. Each new story questioned whether the pursuit of entertainment justified the risks and the suffering of intelligent, social creatures confined to tanks. Melissa's legacy then became more than personal remembrance. It became a cautionary tale at the heart of a moral reckoning. Her story forced audiences to confront an uncomfortable truth. The line between awe and arrogance is razor thin. Humans had sought to tame the ocean's most formidable predator, to choreograph its movements for applause. But in doing so, they underestimated the cost of that control. A cost paid not only in the broken bodies of captive orcas but in the lives of the trainers who placed their trust in them. Today, Melissa Carter is remembered not only for her courage but as a symbol of that warning. Her death was not the first, and it would not be the last, but it stands as a reminder of what happens when the boundaries between nature and spectacle are ignored. The legacy she leaves behind is heavy, sobering, and unresolved, a life cut short, and a lesson that still demands to be learned.